I never imagined that late afternoon would bring back everything I'd spent years trying to bury. The lawyer's office smelled of old paper and expensive furniture polish, scents that reminded me of my grandfather's study. I sat in the last row of the reading room, among cousins who hadn't spoken my name in almost a decade. My black dress felt too tight around my shoulders, probably because I'd built more muscle since the last time I wore it. Military training does that to you. When the lawyer's dry voice announced, Claire Monroe has not been included in the division of assets, no one even pretended to be surprised. My aunt turned her face with a half smile, and my brother, whom I haven't spoken to since our father's funeral, simply lowered his eyes as if this were natural, expected. I breathed deeply. I didn't cry. I didn't react. I just observed in silence, as I'd learned to do during my years away at the base, far from everything. When I returned from the base weeks before the reading, my childhood home was already empty. Nothing remained of the letters I wrote to my grandfather, or the photos he kept in his desk drawer. He always told me, "Those who observe in silence understand before others do." I followed this like a code, even when, at 19, I was called a disgrace for choosing enlistment instead of the college my mother dreamed of. Even when no one showed up at my first promotion ceremony, and now, even sitting there, ignored as if I didn't exist. To continue listening to this beautiful and special story, please like and subscribe to the channel. Write your name and the city you're watching from so I can include a special greeting for you in my next story. But that's when everything changed. The lawyer cleared his throat before rising from his chair. "Ah, there is one final instruction." He walked over to me with a small brown envelope. Inside was a single item, the signet ring my grandfather wore every day, a symbol of his trust, the same one he said he would only give to someone he truly trusted. He left this and said you would know what to do. The silence in the room grew heavy. My aunt frowned. Someone said, "That has no value, it's just an old ring." But I recognized the inscription. It was a date, a promise, and perhaps, the beginning of something no one there ever imagined. Chapter 2. Whispers that followed me home. The weight of the ring in my palm felt heavier than any equipment I'd carried during training. I slipped it onto my thumb, the only finger it would fit, and left without saying goodbye. No one called after me, no one followed, just whispers that trailed behind like smoke. "She doesn't even look the same anymore. The military changed her. Dad always had a soft spot for her, never understood why." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as I walked to my rental car. 5 years since I'd been back to Highland Creek. 5 years of building a life where no one knew me as the Monroe girl who disappointed everyone. In the military, I was Lieutenant Monroe, respected, capable, someone whose silence meant strategy, not submission. Back at the small hotel room I'd booked for the week, I sat on the edge of the bed and studied the ring. It wasn't valuable in the way my cousins measured value, not gold or diamond, just worn silver with my grandfather's initials, and a date etched inside. I'd asked him about it once when I was 12. "What happened on that day, Grandpa?" He'd smiled that gentle smile that never reached anyone else in the family. "That's the day I learned that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't what's written down on paper." I didn't understand that. Staring at the ring now, turning it in the dim hotel light, I still wasn't sure I did, but I knew one thing. My grandfather wouldn't have given this to me without reason. The ring was a key, but to what? The next morning, I drove past our old family home, now belonging to my brother according to the will. The sprawling Victorian looked smaller than I remember. The tire swing I'd spent summers on was gone, and the maple trees had been trimmed back severely, making the house look exposed, vulnerable somehow. I didn't stop. There was nothing for me there now. Instead, I drove to the only place where I'd felt understood, my grandfather's cabin by the lake. It wasn't mentioned in the will reading. Perhaps it had been sold years ago when he moved into the family home after his stroke. I needed to see it once more, to say goodbye to the one place that had felt like home. The dirt road leading to the cabin was overgrown, branches scraping against the car's sides. When I finally reached the clearing, my heart stopped. The cabin was still there, weathered but and sitting on the porch as if he'd been waiting for me, was Timothy Green, my grandfather's oldest friend and attorney. Not the slick downtown lawyer who had read the will, but the man who had known my grandfather for over 60 years. "Took you long enough, Claire," he said, standing up slowly, his cane supporting his weight. "Charles said you'd figure it out by sunset today. I owe him $20. "Figure what out?" I asked, stepping out of the car. that the ring wasn't the inheritance. He smiled, pulling a key from his pocket. It was the map to it. Chapter 3. The Silent Years. Timothy's arthritic fingers fumbled with the lock. Your grandfather changed his will 3 times in the last year, he said, pushing the door open to reveal the cabin exactly as I remembered it. Rustic, warm, unchanged. The family thinks they know everything. But Charles was a careful man. I stepped inside, memories washing over me. Summers learning to fish, winters by the fire, reading while my grandfather taught me chess. The smell of pine and old books still lingered. Why didn't you tell me this yesterday? I asked, watching Timothy settle into my grandfather's favorite chair. Because Charles was specific. Give her the ring in front of everyone, he said. Let them think that's all she gets. She'll understand when it's time. Timothy pulled out an envelope from his jacket. And he wanted me to give you this privately. My hands trembled slightly as I took it. Something that never happened when I was handling equipment at the base. Inside was a letter in my grandfather's neat handwriting. Claire, if you're reading this, you found your way back to the cabin just as I knew you would. While the family fought over the house, the investments in the Monroe name, you were fighting for something else entirely. Your right to choose your own path. When you joined the military, your mother told everyone you'd betrayed the family legacy. What she never understood was that you embodied the true Monroe spirit more than anyone else. We weren't always wealthy landowners. Your great-grandfather built everything from nothing, with discipline and quiet determination. Qualities I see in you. The family believes I left you nothing. They're wrong. The cabin and the 20 acres surrounding it were transferred to a separate trust in your name 3 years ago. Timothy has all the paperwork. It's not the grandest inheritance, but it's yours, free and clear. There's a loose floorboard beneath the window seat, my old hiding place. What you find there isn't valuable to anyone but you and me. Remember what I taught you. Patience outlasts pride and silence reveals more than shouting ever will. All my love, Grandpa. I looked up to find Timothy watching me, his eyes gentle. Did you know? I asked. About the cabin? Yes. About whatever's under that floorboard? No. Charles had his secrets, even from me. I moved to the window seat, feeling underneath until I found the loose board. It came away easily, as if it had been recently disturbed. Inside was a dusty metal box, the kind my grandfather kept special fishing lures in, but when I opened it, I found no fishing equipment. Instead, there were letters, dozens of them, all from me, sent from basic training, from my deployment, from every base I'd been stationed. Letters the family told me he'd never received because he was too disappointed to read them. He'd kept every single one. Beneath them was a small leather notebook and a photograph of us at the lake, taken the summer before I enlisted. On the back he'd written, "The bravest Monroe of them all." I didn't realize I was crying until a tear splashed onto the photo. He read them all, Timothy said quietly, called me after each one. "My girl's changing the world," he'd say, proud as could be. I clutched the letters to my chest. They told me he never wanted to hear from me again. "And you still wrote, every week." Timothy nodded, understanding filling his eye. "That's why you got the cabin, Claire. Not because you're his granddaughter, because you're the only one who loved him without expecting anything in return." The next morning, I woke on the cabin's old couch, the box of letters on the floor beside me. I'd spent hours reading through the leather notebook, my grandfather's private thoughts about the family, about the business, about me. It was a side of him I'd never fully seen, his quiet observations about how the family had changed over the year. April 3, 2018, David and Susan visited today, asking about changing the trust again. Always money with those two. Claire sent another letter from Fort Benning, included a pressed wildflower she found on a training hike, said it reminded her of the ones behind the cab. Not one mention of needing anything, just stories and that flower. That girl understands what matters. I made coffee in the old percolator, watching the sun rise over the lake through the kitchen window. In the military, I'd learned to appreciate these quiet moments before the day's demands began. Standing there, I realized that for the first time since returning, I felt like I could breathe full. The ring sat on the counter where I'd placed it last night. In the morning light, I noticed something I'd missed before, tiny notches around the band, almost like I held it closer. They weren't random marks. They were coordinates. My grandfather had been a surveyor before taking over the family business. He'd taught me how to read maps and find locations, using nothing but landmarks and a compass. These numbers, combined with the date inside, weren't just sentimental. They were directions. I pulled out my phone, converting the notches into actual coordinates. They pointed to a location less than a mile from the cabin, deep in the woods that made up part of the property he'd left me. Before I could think twice, I changed into jeans and boots, grabbed a bottle of water and the old compass from the drawer where it had always been kept. Some things never changed. The woods were cool and damp, morning dew still clinging to the undergrowth. I followed the compass, pushing through thickets that scratched at my arms. The military had taught me to move purposefully through difficult terrain, and I found myself falling into the rhythm of a patrol walk, alert, measured, patient. After 40 minutes of hiking, I reached a small clearing with a massive oak tree at its center. The coordinates led directly to it. I circled the tree, looking for signs of something. Anything. The bark was smooth and unmarked. Then I remembered how my grandfather hid things. Always look where others don't, he'd say. I knelt down, examining the roots that pushed up through the soil. On the north side, partially covered by moss, was a small metal container embedded in the ground between two large roots. I dug it out with my pocket knife, brushing away decades of dirt. Inside was a plastic bag, protecting an envelope similar to the one Timothy had given me. This one was addressed simply, for the one who followed the map. Inside was a deed, not to land or property, but to shares in a company I didn't recognize, Silver Lake Innovation. Along with it was another note, the coordinates and date mark where I first met your grandmother. I proposed to her under this tree. The family fortune didn't come from Monroe Enterprises as everyone believes. It came from a small tech company your grandmother started in our garage, and I kept it separate from the family business, away from greedy hands. These shares represent controlling interest. The company's current value is modest, but its patents are about to change that. Timothy has kept it in trust. He'll explain everything. This is your true inheritance. Not from me, but from the grandmother you never got to meet. She would have loved the woman you've become. I sat under that oak tree for a long time, the deed clutched in my hands, trying to process what this meant, not just financially, but what it revealed about my family's history, about the quiet strength that had flowed through our bloodline, without anyone acknowledging it. When I finally walked back to the cabin, I felt different, not vengeful, not bitter, but certain, the kind of certainty that comes from knowing who you are and where you stand. Timothy was waiting on the porch again, a file folder in his lap. Found the oak tree, did you? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Why didn't he tell them? I asked. About Grandma's company, about any of it. Timothy's laugh was soft, sad. Because your grandfather learned something valuable. When your grandmother died and the family circled like vultures, he learned that some people reveal their true nature when they think there's something to gain. He held up the file, ready to hear about what your grandmother built, and what it's worth now. 17 million, Timothy said, the number hanging in the air between us on the cabin porch. That's the current valuation of Silver Lake Innovation. The patents your grandmother registered are being used in medical devices worldwide. I nearly dropped the mug of coffee I was holding. $17 million. And growing. The company has remained small, private, and extremely profitable. Timothy handed me the file. Your grandmother was brilliant, an engineer when women weren't welcome in those rooms. Your grandfather protected her legacy, the only way he knew how. By keeping it secret, I whispered. By waiting for the right heir. Timothy's eyes were kind but serious. You're not the only grandchild, Claire, but you're the only one who ever asked about her. The only one who sat through his stories without checking the time or asking what they'd inherit someday. The weight of this revelation settled on my shoulders, heavier than any pack I'd carried on training exercises, more significant than any responsibility I'd been given in my military career. This wasn't just money, it was trust. Does anyone else know? I asked. Just the company executive. They've been expecting you. Timothy checked his watch. In fact, they're waiting for a video call with you at noon. Your grandfather arranged everything. In the hours that followed, I learned more about my grandmother than I'd ever known. Ellen Monroe hadn't been just the quiet wife family stories painted her as. She'd been a pioneer developing early prototypes for medical monitoring equipment in an era when most women weren't even hired as secretaries in tech firms. When the video call connected, I found myself facing three people who spoke about my grandmother with reverence. They showed me projects in development, talked about the company philosophy, and never once mentioned the money. At the end of the call, the CEO, a woman in her 60s, said something that made everything click into place. Your grandfather told us you'd come back different. Military precision with Ellen's heart, he said. We've been keeping her seat warm for you. That night, I sat on the dock behind the cabin, the ring on my thumb catching the moonlight reflecting off the lake. Tomorrow I would drive back into town. I would face the family who thought they'd stripped me of my inheritance. And I would say nothing about what I'd learned. Not out of spite, but because my grandfather had been right all along. Silence reveals more than shouting ever will. The Monroe family home looked different now as I parked across the street, observing from a distance. Not smaller or less imposing, just different, like a stage set I could now see behind. The curtains were open in the front parlor, revealing my aunt and two cousins in animated discussion. Probably still dividing the spoils. When I returned from the base weeks ago, I'd driven past this house with a hollow ache in my chest, the pain of exclusion. Now I felt nothing but a strange sense of clarity. The military had taught me to assess situations objectively, to recognize when an objective was no longer strategically valuable. This house, these people, they were not my objective anymore. I didn't need to confront them. I didn't need their acknowledgement, but I did need closure, and there was one person I hadn't spoken to properly in years. I texted my brother, I'm outside, can we talk? 5 minutes later, Michael emerged, looking uncertain. He'd gained weight since I'd last seen him, and his hairline had receded, making him look more like our father than ever. Claire, he said, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. Not approaching, not retreating. I didn't think you'd still be in town. I've been out at Grandpa's cabin, I said, watching his expression carefully. Surprise flickered across his face. The cabin. I thought it was sold years ago. So did everyone. I replied. How's the house settling in? Getting everything you wanted? Michael looked back at the house, then down at his shoes. It's not what I expected, he admitted. Aunt Susan's been here every day telling me what furniture should go where, how Charles would have wanted it arranged. Dad's been calling about taking some antiques for safekeeping. He ran a hand through his thinning hair. I didn't think it would be like this. For the first time, I saw my brother clearly. Not the person who had stood silent when I was pushed out, but someone caught in the family's expectations. Just as I had been. He'd just chosen a different escape route, compliance. Do you remember, I asked quietly, the summer Grandpa taught us to sail on the lake? Michael's face softened. You were better at it. I got seasick. But you kept trying because you thought that's what Dad wanted. And you kept trying because you loved it. He looked at me directly, perhaps really seeing me for the first time in years. I should have been at your promotion ceremony. I wanted to be. But Dad said no. Michael nodded, shame crossing his features. I've never been as strong as you, Clay. We stood in silence for a moment, years of unspoken words between us. Then I did something I hadn't planned. I slipped my grandfather's ring from my thumb. He would have wanted you to have this, I said, holding it out. Michael's eyes widened. But he gave it to you. At the read, I don't need a ring to remember what he taught me. I placed it in his palm, closing his fingers over it. Maybe it can remind you too. My brother stared at the ring, then back at me. What did he teach you that I missed? I smiled, already turning to walk away. That the most valuable things can't be inherited in a will. Michael, they have to be earned through how we live. As I walked back to my car, I heard the front door open. My aunt's voice rang out. Michael, who was that? What are you doing out here? I didn't turn around to see his response. I didn't need to. For the first time since I'd enlisted, I felt the burden of seeking my family's approval lift completely from my shoulders. I hadn't come back to claim what they'd taken from me. I'd come back to realize I never needed it in the first place. Back at the cabin, I stood in the small bathroom, wiping steam from the mirror after a long shower. The face that looked back at me was both familiar and strange. My mother's high cheekbones, father's determined chin, but the eyes were all mine, clear, focused, untroubled by the past few days. When I'd left for basic training 6 years ago, I'd been running away from the suffocation of family expectations. I joined the military not out of patriotism initially, but because it was the furthest thing from the Monroe legacy of country clubs and corporate boardrooms. What I hadn't expected was to find myself there, to discover that the discipline, the clarity of purpose, the straightforward relationships built on trust rather than obligation, would reshape me into someone stronger than the girl who'd fled Highland Creek. As I dried my hair, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Claire, it's Michael. How did you know?" I frowned, typing back. "Know what?" The response came immediately. "About the inscription, the coordinates." I looked inside the ring. I hadn't actually noticed any coordinates inside the ring, just the date. My grandfather had been cleverer than I realized. He'd left different clues for each of us, knowing who would receive the ring in the end. "What did you find?" I texted. "An old photo album in the attic, pictures of you and me at the cabin, with Grandpa, and a letter. He knew I'd give you the ring, said it was a test." I smiled, imagining my grandfather orchestrating all of this from beyond, playing a long game none of us had seen coming. Michael's next text surprised me even more. "Can I come out to the cabin tomorrow? There's something you should see." I hesitated only briefly before responding. "I'll put coffee on at 10. That night I sat on the cabin porch, watching fireflies dance over the lake while reading more from my grandfather's journal. One entry from just 3 months before his death stood out. "Sometimes the greatest act of love is letting someone go their own way, even when others call it betrayal. Watched Claire's military ceremony online. Susan and David think I don't know how to use a computer. Foolish." My girl stood tall in her uniform, could see Ellen's determination in her stance. "The family calls her the disappointment. They're wrong. She's the one who got away clean, the only one who might break the cycle." I closed the journal, tears blurring my vision. All those years thinking he'd abandoned me too when he'd been watching from afar, protecting me in his own way. The next morning, Michael arrived exactly at 10, looking nervous and carrying a battered cardboard box. We sat at the kitchen table, the coffee maker gurgling in the background. "I found this when I was going through Grandpa's study," he said, pushing the box toward me. It was hidden in a wall safe behind his bookshelf. The combination was the same coordinates from the ring. Inside the box were documents, old stock certificates, property deeds, and what looked like a draft of a will dated just 1 month before our grandfather died. On top was a letter addressed to both of us. "Michael and Claire, if you're reading this together, then the plan worked." The ring found its way from one to the other, as I hoped it would. What the family doesn't know, what I've kept from them for decades, is that the Monroe fortune isn't what they think. The house, the cars, the country club memberships, all window dressing, kept to satisfy their expectations while I built something more meaningful with Ellen's company. The will they heard was real but incomplete. This box contains the rest, the true legacy I hope you'll both carry forward. Not just wealth, but purpose. Michael, you've lived trying to be what others expected. Claire, you've lived trying to prove them wrong. Neither path brings peace. Together, you have everything you need to change the family story. The choice is yours." With hope and love, your grandfather Michael and I looked at each other across the table. Decades of misunderstanding and separation between us. But also possibility. "Did you know," he asked quietly, "about any of this?" I shook my head. "I only learned about Grandma's company yesterday." He nodded slowly. "I've spent my whole life trying to be the perfect Monroe heir, and now I find out it was all what? A test? A game?" "Not a game," I said, thinking about my years in the military, the lessons in strategy and patience. "A rescue mission." Michael stayed at the cabin that night, sleeping in the small guest room while I took the couch again. We talked until past midnight, piecing together the puzzle our grandfather had left us. The documents revealed a complex trust structure that effectively gave Michael and me joint control over both the family assets and Silver Lake Innovations, but only if we worked together. He outmaneuvered them all, Michael said, something like admiration in his voice, as we sat by the fire pit outside, "even from the grave." "That's not how he would have seen it," I replied, poking at the embers with a stick. "This wasn't about winning or losing for him." "Then what was it about?" I thought about my military training, about the lessons in leadership that had shaped me more than any family inheritance could. It was about legacy, about what survives after the money and property are gone. In the morning, Timothy arrived with fresh bagels and more files. He wasn't surprised to find Michael there. Right on schedule, he said with a smile. Charles said you'd both be here by day 5. We spent hours going through everything, the full extent of Silver Lake Innovations, the family holdings, the debts that had been quietly growing as our aunt and cousins lived beyond their means, expecting the inheritance to solve everything. So what happens now? Michael asked finally. Do we just announce all this to the family? Timothy and I exchanged glances. What would that accomplish? I asked. They'd have to acknowledge that they were wrong about you, about Grandpa's feelings toward you. I thought about my years in service, about the missions where the objective wasn't about personal vindication but about the greater good. I don't need their acknowledgement, Michael, and revealing everything now would just start a war neither of us wants to fight. So we just let them think they won. We let them think whatever they want, I said, the strategy becoming clear to me now. While we do what Grandpa and Grandma would have done, build something that matters. Timothy smiled, a glint of approval in his eyes. Now you sound like Charles. Later that afternoon, Michael and I walked around the lake, the same path our grandfather had taken us on countless summer days, the path where he'd taught us to identify bird calls and tree species, where he'd told us stories about our grandmother that the rest of the family never seemed interested in hearing. You know what I keep thinking about, Michael said as we reached the small beach where we'd built sandcastles as kids. The last time we were all together. Dad's funeral. You came in uniform. Mom said it was disrespectful. I remembered, the sting of those words still faintly present. She was wrong, Michael said simply. I was too afraid to say it then, but I was proud of you. Dad would have been too, if he'd let himself. I looked at my brother, really looked at him. The weight of family expectation had bent him, but not broken him. There was still the boy who'd built sandcastles with me, who'd followed me into the deep water even though it scared him. It's not too late for us to be the kind of family Grandpa and Grandma wanted. Michael nodded, picking up a flat stone and skipping it across the water, something our grandfather had taught us both. I'm not sure I know how to do that. Neither do I admitted, but I think that's the point. We figure it out together, without the weight of what everyone else expects. As the stone skipped 5 times before sinking, I felt something shift between us. Not forgiveness exactly, but its beginning. A recognition that the past could be acknowledged without letting it determine our future. That night, unable to sleep, I found myself at the small desk in the cabin's main room, a blank piece of paper before me. For years I'd written to my grandfather, believing he never read my words. Now I found myself writing to my parents, words they would never read, but that I needed to say. Mom and Dad, I'm writing this from Grandpa's cabin, where I've learned more about our family in 5 days than I did in 24 years as your daughter. I've learned about Grandma's brilliance, about Grandpa's quiet strength, about the legacy they built that had nothing to do with the Monroe name and everything to do with integrity. I didn't join the military to hurt you, though I know that's what you believe. I joined because, somewhere deep inside, I recognized what you never told me, that our family's story was more complex than the perfect image you worked so hard to maintain. The discipline, the structure, the sense of purpose I found there, these were the same qualities Grandpa valued, the same ones that built the true family fortune you never knew existed. I won't be coming to the house again, not because I'm angry or want to punish you, but because that chapter of our story is finished. Michael and I are writing a new one centered around the cabin and what it represents. You're welcome to be part of it, but only if you can accept that the daughter you thought was a disappointment was actually following a path laid down generations before her, with love and hope for understanding. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope, writing my parents' names on the front. Then I opened my grandfather's journal and slipped it between the pages. Not to send, but to acknowledge. Some words aren't meant to be read by others. They're meant to free us from the weight of carrying them unspoken. In the morning, I found Michael on the dock, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise. I sat beside him, dangling my feet in the cool water. I've been thinking, he said without preamble, about what we should do with Silver Lake. And the medical devices they make. They're saving lives, right? But they're expensive. Not everyone can access them. He looked at me, uncertainty in his eyes. What if we changed that? Used the Monroe money to make Grandma's technology available to more people? I smiled, recognizing in his words the same sense of purpose that had drawn me to military service. I think that sounds exactly like what they would have wanted. It would mean less profit, he warned. The family wouldn't understand. Then we don't tell them. I said simply. Not yet. We just do what's right, quietly, the way Grandpa did. Michael nodded, a new resolve in his expression. I can handle the business side. The MBA was good for something at least. And I can contribute what I've learned about logistics, about deploying resources effectively. I thought about my military training, how it had prepared me for challenges I never anticipated. We make a good team when we're not trying to be what everyone else wants. Partner, Michael held out his hand, my grandfather's ring, now on his pinky finger. I took his hand, feeling the cool metal of the ring against my skin. Partners. As the sun rose higher, casting golden light across the lake, I thought about the journey ahead. It wouldn't be easy. The family would resist changes they didn't understand. There would be legal challenges, difficult conversations, moments of doubt. But for the first time since I'd received the call about my grandfather's death, I felt a sense of rightness, a certainty that I was exactly where I needed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. Not because it was expected, not because it was written in a will, but because it honored the true legacy my grandparents had left. The courage to chart your own course, even when others call it betrayal. 6 months later, I stood in the conference room of Silver Lake Innovations, now serving as the company's chief operations officer, while still maintaining my military reserve status. Through the glass walls, I could see the research and development team working on a new portable diagnostic device, one that would cost a fraction of similar technologies on the market. Michael entered, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. The weight of pretending to be the perfect Monroe heir had lifted from his shoulders, replaced by the meaningful work of transforming our grandmother's company. The board approved the new direction, he said, handing me the meeting minute. We're officially pivoting to focus on accessible medical technology. I smiled, thinking of the journey that had brought us here. And the family? Still in the dark, Michael confirmed. Though Aunt Susan keeps asking why I'm spending so much time at that old cabin, instead of taking my rightful place at the family home. We've decided to keep the truth about Silver Lake and our joint leadership from the extended family for now. Not out of malice, but because we needed time to establish the new direction without interference. They still believed the will reading had been the end of the story, that Michael had inherited the house and family business, while I'd received nothing but a sentimental trinket. Timothy called, I said, changing the subject. The renovation plans for the cabin are approved. We can break ground next month. We were expanding the cabin to serve as both a retreat and the future headquarters for the charitable foundation we'd established in our grandparents' name. The foundation would ensure that Silver Lake's medical innovations reached those who needed them most, regardless of ability to pay. I found something else in Grandpa's papers, Michael said, pulling an old photograph from his briefcase. I think you should have it. The photo showed our grandmother standing in front of an early computer system, pride evident in her stance. She wore a simple lab coat, her hair pulled back practically, but her eyes held the same determination I'd seen in my own reflection countless times. She looks like you, Michael observed. Same expression you get when you're focused on solving a problem. I traced my finger over her image, this brilliant woman whose legacy had been nearly erased from our family's story. We're going to change that, I promised quietly. Make sure everyone knows who she really was. Later that evening, as we sat on the cabin's porch watching another sunset, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Since the will reading, she'd reached out several times, her messages growing increasingly confused about my apparent lack of bitterness over the inheritance. Your aunt said you're working with Michael on some project. What's going on, Claire? I showed the message to my brother. They're getting curious. What do you want to do? He asked. I thought about all I'd learned in the past 6 months about patience, about strategy, about the power of quiet truth over dramatic revelation. My military training had taught me that sometimes the most effective approach wasn't a frontal assault, but a gradual, strategic repositioning. I think it's time we invited them to the cabin, I said finally, not to explain everything at once, but to start showing rather than telling them who we really are, who our grandparents were. Michael nodded slowly. Not out of anger, not out of anger, I agreed. Out of hope that maybe, just maybe, they can learn what we've learned. I typed a response to my mother. Yes, Michael and I are working together on a project Grandpa started. We'd like to show you. Dinner at the cabin next Sunday. The response came quickly. We'll be there. As I set my phone down, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. The ring that had started this journey was now on Michael's finger, The cabin that had seemed like a consolation prize had become the foundation for something new, and the silence that I'd once interpreted as rejection had revealed itself to be my greatest teacher. My grandfather's words echoed in my mind. Those who observe in silence understand before others do. I understood now. This wasn't about revenge or vindication. It wasn't about proving my worth to a family that had dismissed me. It was about honoring the legacy that had been entrusted to us. A legacy of quiet purpose, of meaningful work, of building something that would outlast all of us. As the sun set over the lake, painting the water in shades of gold and amber, I thought about the journey ahead. It wouldn't be easy. Change rarely is. But for the first time I wasn't facing it alone. Do you think they'll ever understand? Michael asked softly. I smiled, watching the last light fade from the sky. I don't know, but that's not why we're doing this. Then why are we? I thought about my years in service, about the oath I'd taken to protect and defend, about my grandmother's brilliance, channeled into healing rather than profit, about my grandfather's patient strategy, playing the long game for something more important than wealth or status. Because some inheritances aren't about what you receive, I said finally, they're about what you give back. And in that moment, surrounded by the legacy of quiet strength that had shaped me more than I'd ever known, I was at peace with all of it. The rejections, the misunderstandings, the years of feeling like I didn't belong. They had led me here, to this cabin, to this purpose, to this understanding, not with bitterness or triumph, but with the quiet certainty that sometimes the greatest victories are the ones no one else ever sees.